Sports with Sean Caravilles.
The Tour de France resumes today after a second rest day with Chris Froome defending his yellow jersey. Here's BBC 5 Live.
The Tour de France.
Welcome to Bespoke at the Tour de France. I'm OJ Borge. Today's the day that the Tour takes a little breather. It is nominated a rest day, but realistically, things never stop at the Tour de France. The riders still go out. There's still branding and stages to be set up. There's still journalists filing copy and sending back pictures to news outlets all over the world, which is where we find two bastions of the journalistic world, authors and journalists both. They are Peter Cossins and Jeremy Whittle as well. And did you know the most important question of this whole Tour de France so far, where we are right now, Le Puy-en-le-Velay. I've got it wrong again, Le Puy, what is it? How do you pronounce it?
Le Puy-en-le-Velay.
There you go.
No. Oui. Le Puy-en-Velay.
There you go. Thank you, Jeremy.
It's on the wall behind.
Did you know that this is where Puy lentils came from? Because I had no idea until somebody gave me a promotional bag earlier on that had some Puy lentils in it.
You never
knew
been to
it.
Sainsbury's?
No, but I know obviously.
There are other supermarkets available, yes, but yes, I did know that.
It's a delicacy of the area. So let's talk about this Tour de France. What has been your highlight so far? Because it's been enthralling.
My highlight has been the stage from Saint-Giron to Foix. That's basically two reasons for that. That's the region I live in France. I live just outside Foix, so I've been waiting months and months for the tour to come by and go over the climbs that I ride regularly. So that was fantastic to see. But also because that stage was just, I think it's one of the best tour stages we've seen for years. Nobody was controlling what was going on. There were attacks going all over the place right from the first moment. Riders going up the road, coming back. We saw Contador and Quintana kind of reborn on that stage and attacking off the front of the race. We saw Froome and all the GC favourites having a go at each other. And then we ended up with Warren Barguil, who was wearing the polka dot jersey, winning in Foix on Bastille Day, and the French crowd going nuts. So that was a great moment.
Have your French neighbours enjoyed this Tour de France?
They, most of them have. I have to say my direct neighbour, he's the chief of police in Foix, so he was making sure everybody was safe and secure. So his overriding feeling was he was glad the Tour de France had gone and was finished, and he could move on basically.
So just a note, never mess with Peter Cossins, because the Foix chief of police will have you in a jail.
I'm worried about how fast I'm driving now.
What's been your highlight so far, Jeremy?
Well, there's been three pivotal moments for me, which I think the first one is Richie Porte's crash on the Mont du Chat, on the descent of the Mont du Chat over a week ago, because I think that opened the race up, because otherwise we would have had two very strong teams controlling affairs. I think that's why we've got a more open race now. So BMC basically lost their mojo when Richie Porte crashed out. The second would be Froome's faltering performance at Périgueux, where I think that really gave belief to his rivals, which is why they're hanging on very grimly for whatever they can get out of this race. So Aru Bardet, I think that was where they saw he can be beaten. And the third moment would be yesterday when he was had the broken wheel at the bottom of that final climb and looked for a minute like, wow, 49, 50 second gap. This is it. It's all over.
Just looking at the general classification standings, this is the battle for the yellow jersey. It has never, in the history of the Tour de France, how many editions now? What, 103, 104?
This is 104th.
104th. It's never been this close as we've got to this point as we hit the second rest day. Chris Froome obviously wearing yellow again after he lost it to Fabio Aru for a few days. Fabio Aru still second, 18 seconds down. Romain Bardet, 23 seconds down. Rigoberto Urán, 29 seconds down. Then Daniel Martin, the Irish rider, a minute and 12 seconds down. So the top five just covered by a minute and 12. As we come into this second rest day and the race starts again tomorrow, who do you think will be happiest, Peter?
I haven't really thought about it that way. I mean, I think they'll all be happy that they're still in contention from that point of view. I think Sky will be. They would want to have had a bigger gap. Probably, if you look at the guys that are a little bit behind Froome, Bardet will be ecstatic because he's always had problems when the race first reaches the mountain to make that switch from riding on kind of flatter stages to taking the big step up into the mountains. He managed to cope with that this year. He has problems in the heat, and he's managed to cope with the heat this year. And his favoured terrain is the high Alps, which is what we're going to reach. So he'll be delighted with the situation he's in. Urán's come from nowhere, so he'll be delighted to be up there. Aru's had a nightmare year since he became leader at the Astana team, so he's kind of reborn as well. And of course you've got Dan Martin, who lost time in that crash where Richie Porte went out. He lost 90 seconds or something at the finish, but he's still in contention as well. So they've all got good reason to be happy.
I'd have thought that Dan Martin must be quite pleased with the way things are going. I don't know if anybody saw the clip a couple of days ago of him stepping off his bike after a stage into, I can't remember which stage it was, maybe it was into Foix.
I think it was, yeah.
And they basically had to straighten him up, and it looked absolutely agonisingly painful, because he was quite badly injured in the crash on the Mont du Chat, damaged his back, and so he's been amazing to be where he is. And he keeps attacking as well. So.
Which is great, and I think part of the reason he's had to attack is because he's had this bad back, because I interviewed him at the bus, I think it was yesterday, and he says his back's 1,000,000 times better. And a tweet he put out, he was actually a suggestion next week, because he's still here, it's crazy he's still here, but he can dare to dream.
I think he can, yeah. I mean, I think the stage Jeremy was talking about when they were going to Foix, I mean, they went up the Mur de Péguerre, that really steep ramp that a lot of people remember just before they dropped down into Foix. And Martin's tactic, he said afterwards, was a simple one of, I'm just going to go on the front and hammer it as hard as I can, because he couldn't get out the saddle and dance on the pedals like he normally would. He just had to stay in the saddle, and so he just rode as hard as he could. And it was only in the last few metres that they managed to kind of distance him a bit, and he managed to get back on. So he's done really well at defending himself in that way, and you could see yesterday he gained some seconds coming into the finish, and he's standing on the pedals again now, so he's obviously in better form. And again, we're sort of reaching a point now where we're going into terrain that will really suit him in the next few days.
And if he hasn't got back pain anymore, I mean, I know how crippling that can be, and to be free of back pain, you do feel reborn, you feel really re-energised, so maybe he will be very active.
Both physically and mentally.
Yes, because it gets you down,
But yesterday, Chris Froome had an interesting day again. It's really been a Tour de France you can't take your eyes off. For people who didn't see what happened yesterday, with his mechanical problem, what was going on at the race at the time with Romain Bardet's team? What happened yesterday, Jeremy?
Well, we were reaching the penultimate climb, the bottom of the penultimate climb, which is the first category climb, so very steep and long, the Col de Perrataillard. And the AG2R team, Bardet's team, went to the front, drove the pace very, very hard. And Froome's already kind of gapped out a little bit at the back of that group, and then had a problem with his rear wheel, which we think was a broken spoke, and he didn't seem to be sure exactly what the problem was. But anyway, he got a wheel change, but it took a little bit of time because the team car couldn't get through to him, and then he had to chase it was literally at the bottom of that climb, all the way up that climb, and through leapfrogging from kind of teammate pacing to teammate, he finally re-established contact with the back of the Bardet group. But for a minute, I think it was 49-50 seconds, I think was on the screen, was the gap. So, given how tight the race is, 50 seconds is huge.
And he really had to go for it. I mean, it was a supreme effort to get back into that yellow jersey group. Yeah,
I think one of the things that stood out for me about the effort that he made was it was the first time we've seen Chris Froome going sort of flat out, perhaps in his best form, or the form we'd expect him to be in. I mean, he didn't distance anybody, but he saved his tour effectively on that day. I mean, Jeremy said that he was 50 seconds down. I mean, if he'd lost 50 seconds, he'd have dropped from first to maybe fifth or sixth place that day. I mean, it would have given his teammate Landa a bit more license to roam and maybe go searching for the yellow jersey as well. So the fact that he managed to jump from teammate to teammate, make that effort and get up there, I think that's a good sign for him looking ahead to the Alps, because I think he's coming into his best form.
He's very tenacious. I mean, this is the tour of his tenacity and his never say die attitude as well. I mean, I think we've seen him in the past, getting to the final week where I can't remember exactly what the gaps have been, but they've been good enough. So they've been significant. They've been 2 or 3 minutes, because we've had time trials and summit finishes where he's slam dunked it every time, and that's not happened this year. So he's having to grit his teeth more than we've ever seen before, and from that perspective, mentally and psychologically, it's very impressive.
Well, if we're talking about him and his ears are burning, let's hear from him, because I met up with Chris Froome a little bit earlier on today, and I started by asking, was there a sense of panic during his mechanical problem that he'd just lost the Tour de France?
Definitely. I mean, there was a good 5-10 minutes there that I thought, this is just knowing the pace that AG2R was setting going into the climb, and I was standing on the side of the road with my teammate Kwiato trying to change wheels. I thought that was potentially game over for me.
Do you think if you wear yellow all the way to Paris, do you think you'll look back on yesterday and think, that was the day I didn't win the Tour de France, but I saved it?
Well, yeah, I mean, let's get to Paris first, and then I can think about that. But certainly, if I just reflecting purely on yesterday, that was a huge save. I think I'm really grateful to have got through yesterday, because that was really touch and go if I was going to make it back or not. If I didn't reach that front group by the top of that climb, I don't believe I'd have made it to the finish line in yellow.
It was a mega effort by you. How much were you on the line getting back onto that group?
I had to give everything, absolutely everything, to get back on there.
Yeah. And the closeness to the Tour de France, it's never been this close to the top ever in the history of the Tour de France. Great for us. What's it like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's stressful, but we knew coming into this year's race. I mean, I said already at the start in Düsseldorf that this is going to be the closest fought battle, closest fought Tour de France I've ever done, and the biggest challenge of my career to date. And I think it's shaping up to be exactly that.
Was it more enjoyable getting the yellow jersey back than getting it in the first place?
Well, I mean, of course, it was a disappointment to lose it in the Pyrenees when I had a bad day. But I am feeling better and better as the race goes on, and hopefully that means we've timed things really well coming into this race. I came in really fresh, and I hope that means that going into the third week now, that's going to put me in better shape than some of my rivals.
Talking about your rivals, who is your biggest rival between now and the Champs-Élysées?
It's not possible just to point at one guy. I mean, it's still such a close race. I'd say my three main rivals would be Romain Bardet, Rigoberto Urán, of course Fabio Aru, who's we're all within 1 minute of each other, even less than that. So it's an incredibly tight race at this point.
I had the line, you mean Fabio Aru, ready to go, but I didn't use it. There was a real sense of relief that was just hanging around Chris Froome, that he was still wearing yellow after yesterday's stage.
Yeah, I'm not surprised because I think, I said this a few days ago, and it's been thrown back at me a few times, but I still think he is not the Froome of past years. I still think there's a little bit of fragility and vulnerability about him, and I think if things went really wrong in the middle of one big stage, he could lose a packet of time. Partly, he's got the strongest team, but they can only perform as well as their leader. So they can't. The team may be great, but if they're having to wait for him, and if he has another moment like he had at Peyragudes, then he'll be in trouble. But based on what we've seen since Peyragudes, he looks like he's coming back into his best form.
But the problem yesterday wasn't a problem with Chris Froome, it was a problem with his bike, and he's had his fair share of mechanical problems. Now, I've not read the unwritten rule book, they obviously didn't hand them out at the start. He wasn't attacked by AG2R yesterday, so they could keep riding on the front. What is this rule around not attacking the yellow jersey?
Well, I think everybody's a bit uncertain about where it came from and who first initiated it. I mean, you go all the way back through the history of the Tour, and there are innumerable instances of the yellow jersey being attacked when he has a puncture or he crashes or whatever. So, I think perhaps it was something that became more apparent in the Armstrong era when I think back to 2003 when the race was going up Lussard-Didenne and Armstrong crashed, and there was the incident there where Ulrich rode on ahead of him and kind of eventually came to a stop.
I think it gets silly sometimes because if somebody makes a mistake, like the other day when Froome rode into the camper vans following Mikel Nievi and Fabio Aru went with him, they got the corner wrong. There's no suggestion anybody should wait then. They made a mistake. Mm-hmm. So whether you're in the yellow jersey or not, if you make a mistake because your bike riding is not good enough or your bike handling is not good enough, that's your problem. If, on the other hand, a spectator runs out to the middle of the road and knocks you over or throws something at you or throws urine in your face, as happened to Froome a couple of years ago, that's different, I think, and that's kind of a mishap out of your own control. If you make a mistake, like you crash or whatever, that's racing.
But following that logic, because I think people have made the comparison with Formula One, that if you're in a race and you have a problem, then your competitors don't wait at any point whether you're leading the race or not. It's different in bike racing. When Fabio Aru attacked because Chris Froome had a mechanical problem, was that wrong of Fabio Aru then?
Well, I think that was unsporting because to me that was the equivalent of in football when you kick the ball into touch because somebody's injured, and then you have the throw in and you're supposed to give the ball back to the opposition team. But if you take the throw in and throw it down the other end of the pitch and score a goal, it's that kind of situation.
But it's still a grey area, isn't it?
Yeah, there's an element of etiquette about it, that you don't break that etiquette, and I think it's so subject to interpretation on the road. Like yesterday, I was thinking, well, they're not waiting for him this time. He's had another mechanical, and they're not waiting for him. But then he was asked about it in the press conference afterwards, and he said, "Oh, the race was on. I have no problem with that."
I think Froome's quite good at playing down the fuss that sort of builds up around some of these incidents. I mean, he's good at playing down fuss about absolutely everything, but I mean, he almost went out of his way to kind of make sure that Aru didn't get a lot of flack for his attack. I mean, it was hard to say. I mean, Aru said afterwards, "I was planning to attack at exactly that point anyway, and I just went." But I mean, no matter how many times you look at it, I mean, Froome puts his arm up and Aru rides straight past him, and they must be getting information from their directors in the radio about Froome's got a mechanical, because he's waving to the
Maybe you
car
saw a
behind.
friend. You don't know.
and also, all the directors in their team cars have a TV mounted on the dashboard, so they can all, and there's a guy sitting beside them as another director or the mechanic, and they obviously see what's going on.
Everybody knew.
Yeah.
Historically, what's great is you've written a book, Peter, called Butcher, Blacksmith, Acrobat, Sweep, which is about the first Tour de France.
That's right, yeah.
And I think I saw you put a tweet out that if somebody had a problem in the first Tour de France, Henri de Grange, the man who came up with the Tour de France, they had to fix it themselves, and no one would have waited.
I mean, that was one of the key, I suppose, the key tactical things in the first Tour de France. Like, if you could keep your bike in one piece and finish a stage, it gave you a huge advantage over your rivals. So I mean, the tactics were all different then. At the start of the stage, they'd all just sprint from the start, despite the fact when they started they were going from Paris to Lyon, which was 300 miles. They'd all sprint away, and I mean, they were riding on dirt roads, so if you were at the front, nobody could see anything behind, because you were just kicking up dust or mud if it was raining. And the tactic there was that not only were you kicking up the dust, but if your bike actually fell apart, if you were at the front and then you had to fix a puncture, or you had to, I don't know, weld it back together or something, like they often had to do in those times, then you were going to lose less time than if you were sitting way back behind everybody else. I mean, it was just fair game then, and I mean, I can't say when.
Yeah. I look forward to Chris Froome trying to fix a broken carbon fibre stay.
There was that great moment as well when probably one of my other moments of the tour, when Oran won the stage after Richie Porter crashed, and he was stuck in one gear, and he was effectively riding like somebody from the first Tour de France. They only had one gear, and it was just. I mean, you can look at the first tour and the 104th tour and say they were completely different races, but there are kind of really interesting comparisons to make.
Well, talking to Chris earlier on, he was very, very honest about how panicked he'd felt when he'd had that mechanical and how he thought that the Tour de France had been lost. And I also spoke to Sky's director sportif, the guy who calls the shots on race day, Nico Portal, about how the rest of the team felt about that moment.
We heard, I need a back chain. It's clearly the first time in maybe 5 years I heard Froome already like panicking, or at least sounds like he was panicking. And then you're like, wow, okay. And my job obviously is to stay calm and try to organize everything with the radio. And it was pretty intense, because at this time the peloton splits. He was in the middle of somewhere. I didn't know exactly. We don't have any TV. And I think we've done a pretty good job for that. I mean, it's pretty simple, we have a plan, who's going to wait. But the issue was more to know exactly what he had, if we can change a bike, who is the closest to him, so try to minimize the time lost. You can clearly lose quickly this 18 seconds. And so for sure he thought like, oof, if I could not come back, and then that could be a big issue. I could lose more than that.
So Nico Portal there saying that it's the most rattled he'd ever seen Chris Froome in the 5 years he's known him.
I can believe he probably was, yeah. I mean, the race was right on. I mean, one of the fascinating things about that point was that AG2R had managed to gather their whole team of 9 riders at the front of the race, and they'd already upped the pace, they'd already strung the line out. They had Oliver Nyssen, who's a classics rider, fantastic at riding very, very quickly on the flat, and he charged into the bottom of that climb, lining everybody out behind him, and they just had one guy after another going. And Froome he had Sky lined up behind them trying to respond. But when he had the mechanical, he knew that his race was it was all going away from him, and I can imagine he was panicking.
I think it was a missed opportunity for them, because I was quite surprised that they didn't start to attack each other and that Aru and Bardet didn't really force it over the top with Uran, and Martin as well. I mean, I'd have thought that over the top of that climb, if they'd really tried to extend that to a minute, then Froome, if that group had been splintered that he came back up to, he was just riding like a fast tempo up the climb, but if that group had been splintered, then he's hopping from rider to rider, he's running out of teammates, Lander's got to come back. It starts to go really wrong, and so I couldn't understand. I mean, he said afterwards, there was a bit of hesitation amongst them, and maybe because it was still a long way from the finish, but it wasn't that far. And a group, say you get a select group of 4 or 5 of the key riders attacking, then they get a much bigger gap.
Yeah, I think Bardet said afterwards that he was surprised as well that people didn't actually join in, because I mean AG2R had launched that attack with the sole purpose. They weren't trying to get rid of Froome at all because they didn't think they could. They just wanted to show their strength, but they knew that Aru had a bad day the day before, and they thought, he's got no teammates around him, we can knock him out of contention, and maybe 1 or 2 other guys will drop out as well. I mean, Quintana did, so I mean he's disappeared completely off the scene. But Bardet was saying he was expecting 1 or 2 guys to join him in attacking over the top, and he wanted, I think, 2 or 3 of them to be away.
I think they might rue that though. I mean, I think that was a real moment yesterday, and they might regret it when we get into the Alps.
Why not then? I mean, because that is the why not, and I've asked a few people and no one really knows why. Was Romain Bardet maybe worried that Chris Froome would get back and he would have blown the tank and he would lose the race? Was that the hesitation?
It's that game of poker, isn't it? That you've got 30 odd kilometres remaining. It's a lumpy finish, lumpy run-in. It's at the end of a long, hard stage. Day before a rest day, you spend a lot of energy and you don't make the time, and then Froome jumps you in the last 5k or whatever. So you actually end up worse off than you would have been if you just sat tight. But I think if you want to win the Tour, then you have to show your hand, And at the moment, I think maybe there is a bit of poker being played by riders now, because it starts to get into that situation where people think, well, Froome will probably win, I can finish 2nd or 3rd, that'll be a great result for me, and they start to consolidate what they've got rather than going for what they could get,
We've spoken to all sorts of people from Team Sky over the past 17 days. The person who's been conspicuous by his absence is Sir Dave Brailsford, not the press day today, which we'll get onto in a second because not everyone was invited to it. The one person who wasn't around, who wasn't speaking to the media, and he has been in the past, he's always been happy to chat, talk about tactics and talk about how his riders are doing, was Sir Dave Brailsford. Why do you think he's been so absent this year?
I think it comes after his winter of discontent with the British media, particularly the written press, because of all the negative coverage that was given to the whole Bradley Wiggins therapeutic use exemption jiffy bag scenario. And obviously in the back of him having appeared at select committees in Westminster, then there was some pretty negative media coverage, and that's why I think the majority of the nationals are excluded. He can't control what I write for the Times. He can't control what we say, in the sense that in the way that he can control, social media more, and Sky can control also what happens in terms of maybe broadcast media a little bit more as well. There's definitely bad feeling between him and kind of a lot of the chief sports writers on the nationals, and that was evidenced this morning when he basically walked straight past them and blanked them.
Do you think it's the wrong tactic of Dave Brailsford to do this?
I think what he's done, it was quite obvious. I mean, he had a discussion with one of the online journalists as well, who's been writing stuff about the same issues that Jeremy's just been talking about, and said, you've not been invited here today, or this is what I was told anyway, I wasn't there, but you've not been invited, and we're not going to allow you to sit in and listen to the interviews. And effectively what he did was create a story for all the media that were there watching. They had the Belgian press who were asking what's going on now, and L'Equipe were there and they were interested to know what's going on. I mean, he could have just gone out on his bike and disappeared when it was all going on, and nothing would have happened. Nobody would have been any wiser. There would have been no story. But now I'm guessing there's going to be stories in the foreign press, in the British press, all about Dave kicking off, basically.
Yeah, and I mean the problem is it's not a good look for a team that's founded on transparency and accountability in the post-Lance Armstrong era, when blacklists and media they ignored the media or refused to talk to the media. It's not a good look for a team that's founded on those basic principles to not be talking to selected media.
Getting hassled by a fly there, Jeremy, aren't you?
Yeah, it's nearly up my nose.
Well, listen, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Let's talk about the rest of the race, because it's poised so beautifully with everyone together. There's still, you probably would be hard pressed to pick a favourite from this point in. Although I will ask you, before we end the show, I will ask you who you think is going to take that yellow jersey back home with them. The stages that are coming up, how do you think teams will race the stages? Because it's a couple of sprint stages, then you've got big mountains, then you've got Izoard, and you've got a time trial as well.
It's going to be interesting to see what they do. I mean, I think the key thing, if it's not going to be Froome who wins, is how the AG2R team perform. Because, I mean, like Jeremy said earlier, they're very much on their home ground. They know those mountain roads really, really well. They're based in Chambéry, which we were in earlier in the race.
And Vincent Lavenue, who's the team manager of Bardet, comes from Briançon.
That's right, yeah. So they're very much on their home patch. And Bardet loves those mountains. He goes strongly in the third week, and it looked like his team were really, for the first time in the race, they were all strong at the same time yesterday. Had like Matthias Frank, who's been non-existent for the rest of the race, Oliver Nyssen, all of them were there at the front of the race. And if they can apply pressure on Froome, what they need to do, Bardet and Lavenue were saying yesterday, is put pressure on Froome, but not on him personally, on his team, so that the team, he can't rely on his teammates. And that's what they've got to do on the Galibier in the first place. It might not work that day, but then they've got to do it again on the Izoard, because that's the critical stage for Bardet. He needs to gain a big amount of time on that day. I would think he probably needs to finish at least 90 seconds ahead of Froome that day.
Okay, no sitting on the fence. Do you think Romain Bardet is winning the 2017 Tour de France?
I'd love to see a Frenchman win it. I really would. I think it would do wonders for the race. It'd do wonders for the sport in France. But I think Chris Froome's going to win the race.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And those are my heart says Bardet, just because, as I said when we did our preview show back in the midst of time, I've never been in France when a Frenchman has won, so I'd love to see that. But my head says Froome.
Well, it's going to be an enthralling final week to the Tour de France. As we say, there's still a lot of racing to go till we get to Paris and the Champs-Élysées to see who takes the yellow jersey home with them.
Sports with Sean Caravilles.